Hello and a very warm welcome to the analyst dated 17 July 2025 brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi, wherein we'll be covering the 7 set of current affairs issues which have featured in today's newspaper, and the handout of this very discussion is available in the description below for your future reference. Beginning with the analysis section, firstly we'll try to understand the concept of pressure groups, what are the different types of pressure groups, what method they use, and what role they play in strengthening the democracy. Moving on to the second topic, herein we'll comprehensively analyze the issue of urban flooding, its causes, its impact, step taken by the government, and what more steps we need to take in order to address this issue of urban flooding. Moving on to the simplified section, herein we'll be covering the 5 set of current affairs issues in the most simple manner possible, and we'll also be doing the relevant value addition which would be relevant for your prelims exam. So stay tuned. So let's begin with our first topic, which is related to role of pressure groups in Indian democracy. This particular topic we can associate with GS paper 2, herein we have a direct topic, that is pressure groups. Why are we discussing this concept of pressure groups? Because recently the farmer body named Indian Coordination Committee of Farmers Movement, which is basically a network of the farmers organization across 11 states, for example Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, Haryana, Tamil Nadu, etc. Now they have warned the government that to exclude the agriculture related provisions when you are finalizing the trade deal with USA, and this you need to do in order to protect the interest of the farmers in India. And if you ignore our advice, then we would be launching a movement in this respect, okay, to protest against incorporation of any provision in this trade deal that we are going to sign with US, which is against the farmers' interests. Now, what we need to understand, why is it so that the farmers' body are raising a concern with respect to the trade deal that we are going to sign with US? First and foremost reason is USA have a trade deficit when it comes to agriculture. So that is the reason when it comes to the trade deal, USA would be putting a pressure on the Indian officials so that we start importing corn and soya bean from USA, which would be negatively impacting the Indian farmers. Then another concern which has been raised by the farmers group is that USA is heavily subsidizing its agriculture commodities, and if they enter into the Indian market, this would be leading to a reduction in the prices, which would be negatively impacting the interest of the farmers. It would be good for the consumers, but not in the interest of the farmers. And this has been validated by a report released by SBI recently. So SBI in its report has pointed out that if we allow the import of US, goods, especially in the dairy sector, what would happen? If we open our markets for US goods in the dairy sector, this would lead to a drop in the milk prices by roughly 15%. So you can understand how negatively it would be impacting the farmers' interest, and we would not be able to realize the idea of doubling of farmers' income. Okay, so now in this respect, the first thing that we need to look into is what are pressure groups first of all. So pressure groups are basically defined as a group of people who are actively defending and promoting their common interests. But you need to make note of this particular point, that the pressure groups, they do not aim to hold any public or political office, but they do influence the government decision making and policy formulation through various methods. Now, another aspect that we need to look into is what are the different types of pressure groups that we see in case of India. So first type is institutional interest groups. So this basically consists of the people who are part of government organizations. Like we have Association of IPS officers, IAS officers, or Association of Government Bank Employees, etc. Then we have associational pressure groups, which basically associate themselves with a particular sector or with a particular profession. Like we have the Confederation of Indian Industries, which basically represents the interest of the industrial sector. Then we have Sanyukta Kisan Morcha, which basically represent the interest of the farmers. Okay, and we have All India Trade Union Congress as well. So these pressure groups basically reflect the or basically defend the interest of a particular sector or a particular profession. Then we have non-associational type of pressure groups, which are basically based on commonality of religion, caste, language, etc. For example, we have Karni Sena, which basically, promotes the interest of the Rajput. And we have RSS, which is basically formed on commonality of Hindu religion. Then we have anomic kind of pressure groups which are created as a reaction to a particular situation or to a particular issue. For example, we have Naxalites group. For example, we have Narmada Bachao Andolan. For example, we have United Liberation Front of Assam, etc. Now, as I told you that when it comes to pressure groups, they don't aim to hold any political office. Then what is the difference between the pressure groups and the political parties? So first difference we have already discussed, that when it comes to pressure groups, they don't aim to hold any political office, but this is a characteristics which is associated with the political parties. Then what all methods are used by the pressure groups? So pressure groups use methods like electioneering, propagandizing, lobbying, etc. They also use non-constitutional methods like strike, protest, etc. But when you talk about political parties, they can only use constitutional methods. Okay. Then when you talk about pressure groups, as I told you, certain pressure groups are formed as a reaction to a particular situation. So certain pressure groups like the Narmada Bachao Andolan, this was a kind of temporary pressure group. Okay. When you talk about the political parties, they are usually continuous in nature. Okay. They are not temporary. I am talking in general. Okay. Then when you talk about accountability to the people, so political parties, once they come into power, they have a direct accountability to people. Okay. By a means of citizens charter, RTI, etc. But when you talk about pressure groups, they are not directly accountable to the people in general. And when you talk about the political parties, they are basically formed on the commonality of ideology. But when you talk about the pressure groups, they are basically formed on the commonality of interest. Okay, so this is another difference between the two. Now, as I told you, they use different methods to influence the government decision making and policy formulation. So what are those methods? First method is electioneering. So what they will be doing in electioneering? They would be supporting such a candidate in the election who would be sympathizing with the group interest. Okay, so they would be mobilizing the voters and they would make sure that that person gets enough number of votes. Okay, so that once that person enter and become a part of the government, then that person would be coming up with the policies which would be in sync with the group interest. Then another method is lobbying. So what they do, herein they have a direct communication with the government employees and they persuade them to formulate and to implement such policies which are in sync with the group interest. For example, the telecom association, they lobbied with respect to net neutrality and ultimately this gave fruits. In 2016, net neutrality was accepted. What is net neutrality? You need to let me know in the comment section. Then another method is propagandizing. So what they do in propagandizing, they will be using the social media campaigns to basically mobilize the public on a particular issue. For example, we had this online campaign that is hashtag Students Life Matter. This campaign was launched by the student related pressure groups who are basically demanding for the rescheduling of the exam calendar in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic. Then the another method which is used by the pressure groups is funding of the political parties. Why they do the funding of the political parties? Again, so that once this political party becomes a part of the government, then that political party would be enacting or formulating such policies and laws which would be in sync with the pressure group's interest, common interest. Then at times we have seen that pressure groups also resort to non-constitutional methods like strike, protest, sometimes violence also. Example is United Liberation Front of Assam, and we also have Naxalite groups. Okay. So these are the methods which are used by the pressure groups. That is how they have an influence on the government decision making. Now, what role the pressure groups actually play in the democracy and how do they strengthen the democracy? So they help in interest articulation. They enable the government to understand that what is the public opinion even in between the elections. Example is the India Against Corruption movement, which made the government aware that yes, the public demand a concrete action against the rising corruption instances, and that ultimately led to the passage of the Lokpal Act. Okay, so pressure groups help the government to understand the public opinion even in between the elections. Then they help in holding the government accountable. Best example could be the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan. Their movement actually led to the passage of RTI Act, Right to Information Act. Another example could be of Greenpeace, which hold the government accountable, especially with regard to the environmental regulations and laws. Then they act as a safety valve. So they enable the public to vent out their frustration, and this enable the government to understand the public pulse, and accordingly they can bring the modification in their policies and laws. For example, the movement which was launched by the farmers group, that is the Sanyukt Kisan Morcha and Bharatiya Kisan Union, against the 3 farm bills, and ultimately the 3 farm laws were repealed by the government. Then they help the government to understand the diverse perspective. Actually, they act as a communication link between the section of the society they are representing and the government. They give voice to the minorities. For example, the NAS Foundation is known for promoting the interest of the LGBTQ plus community. Okay, so they help in bringing the necessary changes also, and ultimately their efforts led to decriminalization of the homosexuality also. Then they help in policy formulation also by giving expert inputs when it comes to policy formulation. So before the budget, the government do have consultation with the industrial bodies like FICCI and CII to get the inputs from them, and then accordingly the budget is formulated. So this helps the government to adequately understand that what is the real economic scenario. Then they also help in increasing the political education of the people. For example, one great example is Association of Democratic Reforms. This particular institution has at times educated the public with regard to the electoral matters. For example, with respect to electoral bonds. So that's how pressure groups actually help in strengthening Indian democracy. Now there's a flip side to this as well. They also at times threaten the Indian democracy. How? By promoting and defending narrow interests only, which are at times in conflict with the national interests. For example, Karni Sena, defending the reservation for the Rajputs, which goes against the idea of meritocracy. And at times what happens? Different pressure groups representing different sectors and professions. This leads to gridlocking in policy making, because at times the interest of 2 pressure groups are in conflict with each other. So it becomes difficult for the government to decide that they should pursue or they should give effect to interest of which of the pressure groups. Okay, so this leads to a deadlock kind of a situation when it comes to policy making. And at times this also discourages the government to bring out the necessary reforms. For example, the threat from the farmers' body time and again with regard to whatever reforms the government is trying to bring in, ultimately at the end it would be discouraging the government to bring the necessary reforms when it comes to the agriculture sector. Then we are witnessing arm twisting. As we discussed, that one method which is used by the pressure groups is funding of the political parties. Now when you fund the political parties, why are you doing this? So that once that political party become a part of the government, it would be formulating only such policies, such laws which would be in sync with the group interest. But when this happens, this reduces the trust of the public both in the pressure groups as well as the political party. And this actually disturbs the fine balance between the negotiation and the undue influence. Okay, and this is also with respect to lobbying as well. Because when it comes to India, we don't have a regulatory framework to regulate this lobbying method, okay, which is used by the pressure groups, unlike what we see in USA. So in USA, they have a proper regulatory framework in place which regulate the lobbying activities. So everything is done in a very transparent manner. But since in India, everything is happening behind the curtains, so we don't know actually that, it could happen that the corporate related pressure groups might be pursuing their own interest, and this would be at times in conflict with the larger public interest. Okay, so this raises the concerns of corruptions as well. And lastly, At times, since they resort to non-constitutional methods like strike, violence, etc., this hinders the peaceful mechanism to put forward your interest in front of the government. Now, what needs to be done to strengthen the role of the pressure groups when it comes to Indian democracy? So first and foremost, we need to come up with the clear rules which would be regulating the relation of pressure groups with the political parties, so that we can maintain that fine balance between negotiation and undue influence. And this would embolden the trust of the public when it comes to both pressure groups as well as the political parties. Then we should make sure that the pressure groups do not resort to unconstitutional means. Okay, they should resort to constitutional means like awareness, legal advocacy, etc. And we need to also address the regulatory vacuum that we discuss is there with respect to lobbying, so that we can address the concerns of the public that these lobbying methods are not being used for promoting only the corporate interest vis-a-vis the public interest. Then the government needs to put in place inclusive dialogue platforms wherein it can on a timely basis, it can engage with the different pressure groups, civil society organizations, NGOs, etc. And we can have a constructive dialogue with respect to a particular issue, so that the pressure groups do not need to resort to any unconstitutional method, okay, to defend their common interests. And lastly, if the pressure groups want to play a larger role when it comes to Indian democracy, they should broaden their focus, okay, when it comes to the interests that they are defending and they are promoting. Only then they would be able to realize the idea of participative democracy. Wherein we make sure that none of the voices goes unheard when we are formulating any national policy or program. That's all that we need to know with regard to this particular topic. We have a PYQ with respect to this particular topic. So based on the methods that we have discussed with regard to pressure groups, try to address this particular question. And I've also framed a practice question for you people. So do try this question. With this, let's move on to the next topic. Now, beginning with the second topic, which is related to urban flooding in case of Indian cities. This particular topic you can very well associate with GS paper 1, especially the topic related to urbanization and its associated problems. And you can also relate it with the disaster management portion of GS paper 3. So why are we discussing this issue of urban flooding? Because what we have came across that every monsoon, we are witnessing urban flooding in the city of Gurgaon, despite this region merely receiving 600 millimeters of rainfall. We have also previously witnessed urban flood instance in Delhi way back in 2023, and in 2022 we have also witnessed urban flooding instances in Ahmedabad as well as Bangalore. So this points out that urban flooding has become a regular phenomena when it comes to the urban cities. So in this particular article, we'll try to explore that why is it so that urban flooding has become a regular phenomena when it comes to Indian cities. Now the first thing that we need to understand is what is this urban flooding? So urban flooding basically implies inundation of land and property, especially in areas which are densely populated. Okay, that basically we are referring to urban areas, and it is merely because of poor drainage system, concretization, etc. Now let's understand and explore the different causes of urban flooding. Why is it so that the urban cities in India are being prone to urban flooding instances in the recent times? So first and foremost issue is concretization. See, in rural areas what happens is, therein we have agriculture land, so there is less concretization. So whenever there is rainfall, that water would be percolating down and it would help in groundwater recharge. Okay, but what happens in urban areas? Because of concretization, we have roads, we have pavements, we have building. So there is less land from where the excess rainfall can actually be used for recharging the groundwater. And this excess rainfall that we are getting, that is being, contributing to surface runoff. So this is one of the prominent reasons why we are witnessing urban flooding in India. Now because of urbanization, as it is anticipated that by 2030, roughly 50% of our population would be living in the urban areas. Now this implies that we would be encroaching more and more on the natural water, reservoirs which are there. What would happen because of this? Now see, the natural canals, the natural water reservoirs which are there, they have the ability to absorb the excess rainwater. And because of urbanization, since we are encroaching upon these natural water bodies, what is happening? The city's ability to absorb excess rainwater is going down and going down further. And this we can very well validate by giving the example of Gurgaon itself. Previously, it had 60 natural canals, but because of urbanization, because of concretization, because of encroachment, it is only left with 4 natural canals. So this implies what? That the ability of the cities to absorb the excess rainwater is going down with the passage of time. And a study which was carried out by National Institute of Urban Affairs, this has pointed out that because of this concretization thing, what is happening? Majority of the cities in India, like for example, you take the example of Delhi, you take the example of Surat, you take the example of your Thiruvananthapuram, etc. What is happening in these cities? Because of concretization, they are losing 60 to 70% of the water, which could actually be used to recharge the groundwater aquifers and which could help us in addressing the water crisis issues that we are witnessing in major cities like Bangalore. Okay. Now, another factor is meteorological factors. Because of climate change, we are witnessing extreme precipitation. Okay, that led to flood in Mumbai way back in 2005, and because of this extreme precipitation, we witness urban flooding situation in Chennai way back in 2015. And because of climate change, again, we witness rapid melting of the snow, and that led to flood-like situation in Sikkim in 2023. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had further pointed out that in the light of climate change, Indian cities would become more and more vulnerable to the urban flood instances. So we need to take adequate action in this respect. Then another prominent factor is the drain pane. See, when it comes to the Indian cities, the drainage system is ill-equipped to deal with the increased population density and to deal with the extreme weather events that we are witnessing. If you talk about Delhi itself, its drainage system was planned last time in 1976 roughly. So it has been around 40-50 years since we have brought the necessary changes when it comes to the drainage system, and that is the reason whenever we witness increased rainfall, our drainage systems are blocked, and that further adds to the urban flood instances. Then we have the coastal conundrum, which basically implies what? That the coastal cities like your Mumbai, Chennai, Kolkata, because of the climate change induced sea level rise, they would become more and more vulnerable to urban flood instances. And this is going to cause huge economic loss as well. If you go by the report of McKinsey India, which it came up with in 2021, with respect to Mumbai, this report talks about that Mumbai would become more and more prone to flash floods, and this intensity is going to increase by 25%. What are flash floods? Wherein we witness flood-like situation, okay, because of the extreme rainfall within very short period of time. Short period of time basically means less than 6 hours. So because of huge rainfall, when you are witnessing flood-like situation, that too in a very short period of time, that is less than 6 hours, that situation is basically referred to be as flash floods. So Mumbai would be more and more prone to flash floods like situation. And why will it be so? Because of the rise in sea level rise, which is projected to rise by 0.5 meter. So this is going to make the coastal cities more and more vulnerable to the urban flood instances. And you need to understand the relevance of coastal cities. They are the one which are enabling us to realize the idea of port-led development. So if they would be impacted, our trade would also be impacted, that we majorly do with the shipping. And lastly, one major factor is ignoring the topography. So in today's article, the writer has pointed out and given the example of Gurgaon, wherein we have the Aravalis at the southern side of the Gurgaon. So water actually flows from southern side to northern side. But this topography has been largely ignored by the urban planners when they are, deciding and developing the roads when it comes to Gurgaon city. So this actually intensifies the surface runoff situation, which actually leads to urban flood situation in the city of Gurgaon. Now, what are the impacts of urban flooding? So first and foremost, it is going to cost you economically. So the flood that we witnessed in Mumbai way back in 2005, this led to a loss of nearly $1 billion because at that time the financial capital was completely shut down, okay, because of the urban flooding situation. Then way back in Chennai, when we witnessed urban flood situation in 2015, this cost us $3 billion. And to make the matter worse, World Bank has pointed out that on a global level, if we don't take proactive actions, mitigation strategies, then urban flooding would be causing roughly $1 trillion by 2050. So this would be the economic loss which the cities across the world has to bear. Okay, so we need to take adequate proactive measures in this regard. Then it also adds to public health crisis. See what happens during the flooding. The flood water get mixed with the sewage water and the industrial waste, which create a perfect ground for the spread of waterborne diseases. And that is what we witness in case of Patna. In 2019, we witnessed widespread malaria and diarrhea outbreak. And this was something that we witnessed in case of Mumbai also. Way back in 2005, there was an outbreak of leptospirosis, which is basically referred to be as rat fever also. Okay, it is a bacterial infection, which is also spread because of the contaminated water. Then it creates issues when it comes to mobility in the urban areas. So when the Bangalore, as I discussed in the context itself, in 2022, we witnessed urban flood situation in Bangalore city. So because of this, the IT sector reported daily losses of over 200 crores. Why? Because the urban transportation system has come at a halt. Then the urban poor are at high risk, okay, whenever we witness the urban flood instances. Why? Because the urban poor basically lives in slums. And normally we witness outbreak of waterborne diseases. It is common in slums and this get intensified during the urban flood instances. Okay, and that's what happened in Mumbai way back in 2005. And because of this urban flood situation and because of the disease burden, what happened? They get trapped in the vicious cycle of poverty also. Okay, they are not able to come out of the vicious cycle of poverty. So the urban poor are disproportionately affected by the instances of urban floods. And lastly, urban flooding instances also lead to cultural losses as well. This we can validate by pointing out the urban flood instance that we witnessed in the city of Hampi. Okay, when excess water was released from the Tungabhadra reservoir, and that led to severe damage to this UNESCO World Heritage Site. So urban flooding do not just cause economic related losses, not just health related losses, but they also lead to culture related losses as well. Now, what all steps the government has taken in order to enhance the resilience of our cities when it comes to urban flood instances? So we have the Urban National Flooding Program, which is focusing upon flood risk assessment, wherein we'll be doing the vulnerability mapping, that which all cities are more prone to urban flood instances. And based on that assessment, we will be taking the proactive mitigation and adaptation measures. Then we have Smart City Mission, wherein we are basically focusing upon the technology related solution. So we are trying to do real-time monitoring of the flood situation and we are focusing upon the early warning systems. Then we have the Amrut mission, wherein we are focusing upon upgrading the urban infrastructure, particularly focus is on improving the drainage system, okay, so that our drainage system are well equipped to deal with increased rainfall intensity situations. Then we have the NDMA Urban Flooding Guidelines of 2010, wherein we are again focusing upon flood risk assessment, okay, vulnerability mapping needs to be done, and based on that, a disaster management plan need to be prepared, okay, at different levels, local body level, state level, etc. Then we have certain city level initiatives also. For example, in Mumbai, in Brimstowat project, we are basically focusing upon cleaning of the major drainage that is there before the monsoon. Then we have sea flows in Chennai, wherein we are basically focusing upon early warning system. Then in Kolkata, we have Kolkata Environmental Improvement Project. Again, herein we are focusing upon cleaning of the drainage system, desilting of the drainage system. And we have Bangalore, wherein we are focusing upon lake rejuvenation, use of rain gardens, bioswales, and removal of encroachment on the stormwater drains. Okay, what are bioswales? So these are basically a narrow lane wherein we do shallow vegetation, okay, in the urban areas itself. So whatever rainwater would be coming, so it would be getting filtrated and then it would be percolating down to recharge the groundwater aquifers. Okay. So apart from the steps which the government has already taken at the national level, at the city level, what more steps can we take in order to enhance the resilience of our cities when it comes to urban flood related instances? So first and foremost, in the urban areas, we need to identify the areas which are commonly witnessing waterlogging situation. And we should actually convert these areas into rainwater harvesting areas, wherein whatever excess rainwater we have, we should actually use that to recharge the groundwater aquifers. This would help us in addressing the water crisis that we are witnessing in major cities like Bangalore. Then another suggestion which the writer has given in today's article is related to building French drains, wherein the writer is talking or saying this, that instead of concretization, what we should do above these perforated pipes, what we need to do, we need to place here, gravels and sand, so that water can easily percolate, okay, down to these particular pipes, and we can easily transfer the water, excess rainwater, away from the waterlogged areas to another areas where maybe there would be deficiency of the water. Then we need to incorporate the international best practices. For example, the Spawn City Revolution which we are seeing in China. So what we are doing under this, we would be leaving certain piece of land, not concretizing it, okay, creating bioswales. So with the help of these particular land, what the China is able to do, it is able to retain 70 to 90% of the rainfall which its cities are getting. Okay, this would go a long way in addressing the issue of water crisis also. Then we should incorporate the best practice at the international level, which we are seeing in Singapore also, smart water assessment network, wherein it is basically focusing upon early warning system. How we are going to, detect that, okay, flooding situation might be there, by putting in place smart sensors in the drainage system. Okay, so those smart sensors, by real-time monitoring of the water level, they would be able to tell the authorities that, okay, we are going to witness flood-like situation, and accordingly proactive measures could be taken to deal with the situation. Then we need the participation of the community. Okay, in this respect, we should learn from the water squares thing which is being implemented in Rotterdam. So what we are doing in Rotterdam, we are creating some certain public spaces wherein we have created bioswales, okay, leaving it unconcretized, okay, so that the excess rainwater could be used to recharge the groundwater. Okay, so this is something that we can also adopt in case of India as well. We need community participation to catch all the rain. So we need community participation to realize the idea of rainwater harvesting. And lastly, we need to put in place flood resilient architecture. So herein we can implement the idea of float houses, which is being implemented in other countries. Okay, so this would go a long way in making sure that our cities are resilient to urban flood instances. That's all that we need to know. We have a PYQ on this particular topic, and I have also framed a practice question for you people. So do practice this question. With this, let's move on to the simplified section. So beginning with the simplified section, today is a very proud moment for all the Indians. Why? Because India has achieved a key climate milestone 5 years ahead of the schedule. So we have put forth in front of us a target that we'll make sure that by 2030, non-fossil fuel sources should account for 50% of the installed electricity capacity in India. But the good news is we are able to meet this particular milestone in 2025 itself. This particular topic we can relate with prelims, especially the environment section. So under the Paris Agreement in 2015, we had committed that by 2030 we'll make sure that non-fossil fuel capacity should comprise of 40% of the total installed capacity in India. But in 2022, we increased this target to 50%. And the good news is we are able to achieve this particular milestone 5 years ahead of the target. When I say non-fossil fuel capacity, I'm basically referring to solar power, wind power, hydropower, nuclear power, biopower, etc. So when we started in 2015, the non-fossil fuel capacity was merely 30% of the total installed electricity capacity in India. But today, it accounts for 50% of the total electricity, installed capacity. When I talk about the contribution of the different non-fossil fuel sources, so major contribution is basically from solar power, then we have the wind power projects, then we have the hydro projects, okay? And accordingly, you can look into the data points of other non-renewable sources. So according to International Renewable Energy Agency, Renewable Energy Statistics of 2025, India ranks 4th globally if you talk about renewable energy installed capacity, 4th in terms of wind power energy installation, 3rd in terms of solar power capacity. And over a period of time, as you can see from this particular graph also, that how much growth we have been able to make in terms of the amount of electricity being generated from the renewable energy sources. So in 2014, nearly 76 gigawatt was generated from the renewable energy sources, and today in 2025, 227 gigawatt is being generated from the renewable energy sources. But does this mean that this is going to reduce our reliance when it comes to the thermal power plants? The answer is no. Why? Don't you think it is very confusing? Although, when it comes to the thermal capacity, it is falling below the halfway mark, but that does not mean that our reliance on the thermal power would be going down below 50%. Even today, the thermal plant still produce 70% of the country's electricity. Why is it so? Because of the intermittent nature of the renewable energy sources. Solar energy, you can only generate solar energy during the daytime, not during the night time. Okay, so due to this, when it comes to the renewable energy, they have low capacity utilization factor. Capacity utilization factor means it basically measures that how much available energy is actually being used by the public. So when you talk about solar energy, it has a CUF of merely 20%, wind energy 25 to 30%, and when you compare it with coal, it is having a capacity utilization factor of 60%. So this means that we are still dependent upon the thermal power plant. So this points out to one fact that the another target that we have put in front of us is that we will make sure that 500 gigawatt of electricity is being generated from non-fossil fuel sources, and this we have to do by 2030. Keeping this thing in mind that although the renewable energy, forms 50% of the installed electricity capacity, but then also we are dependent upon thermal power plant, okay, for the electricity consumption. So meeting this particular target would be a huge challenge for India, because currently if you look at the advancement, we are able to produce roughly 227 gigawatts from the renewable energy sources, and we have to meet the target of 500 gigawatt by 2030. So this seems difficult. And why is it so? Because of the storage issue, because of this intermittent nature of the renewable energy, you cannot provide 24/7 electricity supply. That is the reason people are not dependent upon this renewable energy sources, rather they are more dependent upon the electricity being generated from the thermal power plant. And we also have storage issue. If we have adequate storage infrastructure, so we can store whatever energy we are generating from the wind power, projects, from solar projects, etc. And based on the demand, we can use that particular stored energy. But when you talk about the data point, by the end of 2024, India's storage capacity is less than 5 gigawatt. So this is problematic. Even though renewable energy sources, they are contributing more when it comes to installed electricity capacity, but they are not able to generate enough amount of electricity which is being used by the public. Although the government has taken certain steps, like the Central Electricity Authority has issued an advisory to co-locate energy storage system with solar projects in future tenders to ensure grid stability. Because of this intermittent nature of this renewable energy sources, we are not able to get 24/7 supply. So that is the reason the Central Electricity Authority has stated that we need to make sure that adequate storage infrastructure is, located along with the solar projects that are there. And Ministry of Power has also, providing the support to the private players with respect to viability gap funding scheme for battery storage. This would enable us to add 30 gigawatt hours of storage. But there are implementation issues as well. Now, what more needs to be done? So we need to put in place hybrid power projects. Okay, so we can combine the solar, wind, hydro and storage elements to meet India's growing peak and round the clock power needs. And we can also come up with the differential power tariffs. For day and night, we can charge differently. So when you will be charging differently for day, okay, then the private players would also be incentivized to invest in the storage system, when they would be able to get the electricity at a cheaper rate during the daytime. So they will invest in the storage ecosystem, and they would actually prefer to get the electricity from the renewable energy sources. Okay, and this would help us in increasing the capacity utilization factor when it comes to the renewable energy sources. That's all that we need to know with regard to this particular topic. Let's move on to the next one. Recently, the cabinet has taken a decision to merge 36 schemes and to come up with Pradhan Mantri Dhan Dhanya Krishi Yojana. This particular topic we can associate with agriculture portion of GS paper 3. So this Yojana was announced in this year Union Budget itself, and currently the cabinet has taken a decision that they would be merging 36 schemes of 11 ministries. And when it comes to this particular scheme, the outlay would be 24,000 crore on a yearly basis, and this outlay would be there for the next 6 years also. When it comes to implementation of the scheme, the centre government would be collaborating with the private players as well as the state governments for its effective implementation. When it comes to this particular scheme, the intended benefits would be that it would enable us to enhance the agriculture productivity and increase the adoption of sustainable agriculture practices. And the government has stated that this would nearly be benefiting 1.7 crores farmers. The Yojana is basically modeled on the success of Aspirational District Program. So as under the Aspirational District Program, we were targeting or focusing upon certain aspirational districts, the same thing that we are going to do under this particular Yojana. So the government would be identifying 100 districts. While choosing the 100 districts, the government would make sure that from every state, at least we are taking one particular district. So these districts would basically be identified based on 3 indicators: low agriculture productivity, low cropping intensity, and less credit disbursement. What do I mean by cropping intensity? How efficiently I am using this piece of agricultural land. That means how many agriculture crops I am growing on this piece of land in a particular year. Okay, so if I am growing less number of crops, that means there is low cropping intensity in that particular region. Okay, so when it comes to this particular scheme, it would be the first of the kind scheme which would be focusing exclusively on the agriculture and the allied sector. The government is planning that with the help of this particular Yojana, we will be able to enhance agriculture productivity, increasing the adoption of crop diversification and increase adoption of sustainable agriculture practicing. And here on, the government would also be focusing upon improving the post-harvest storage infrastructure. As you can see, okay, these are the intended benefits. Herein, the government would focus upon improving the irrigation facilities, improving credit availability, improving the post-harvest storage infrastructure at the panchayat as well as at the block level, and we would be incentivizing the farmers to adopt the idea of crop diversification and sustainable agriculture practices, and ultimately this would enable us to enhance the agriculture productivity. Going further, Under this particular Yojana, a district agriculture and allied activities plan would be finalized, okay, by the district Dhan Dhanya Samiti, wherein we'll also be having the representatives from the farmers group. And this district plan would be aligned to the national goals of crop diversification, conservation of water and soil health, self-sufficiency in agriculture and allied activities, as well as expansion of the natural as well as organic farming. Okay, and the monitoring of the progress of the scheme would be done on a monthly basis. Okay, the monitoring as we do under the aspirational district program as well. The same feature is also there with this particular Yojana. Now, when it comes to identification of the 100 districts, we are using low credit availability. But experts have pointed out that instead of using this as an indicator, we should actually use annual net agriculture income per hectare. Okay, this is also in alignment with the idea of doubling the farmer's income as well. Now, let's note down certain pointers with regard to aspirational district program as well. So, this was launched by Niti Aayog in partnership with the state governments. The objective was to accelerate the development of 112 most underdeveloped districts across India. Guiding principles were 3 C's: convergence, collaboration and competition. Convergence, here we were focusing upon alignment of the central as well as state schemes so that we avoid duplication of the efforts. Okay. Then collaboration between the central and the state official to ensure effective implementation of the scheme. And competition basically through delta ranking that would incentivize the districts to work upon, improving the socio-economic indicators when it comes to that particular district. Okay, this would give a boost to competitive federalism model as well. Then what all approach we were adopting under this particular program? So it focuses upon leveraging the unique strength of a particular district, and we basically focused upon low-hanging fruits for quick and impactful improvement. When you talk about the monitoring mechanism, herein the progress was monitored on a monthly basis, and on a monthly basis Niti Aayog comes up with the delta ranking, and this is something, as we discussed, is also there with the Yojana, okay, Pradhan Mantri Dhan Dhanya Krishi Yojana. Here also the monitoring would be done on a monthly basis, and ranking would be based on the improvements which a particular district would be making across 49 performance indicators under 5 broad socio-economic themes. What are the 5 broad socio-economic themes? Health and nutrition, education, agriculture and water resource, financial inclusion and skill development, and infrastructure. That's all that we need to know with regard to this particular topic. Let's move on to the next one. Today's The Hindu editorial basically talks about the adoption paradox. This particular topic we can associate with GS paper 2. Why is it so that in India we are witnessing adoption paradox? Because more number of parents have registered themselves for adoption of children, but when you look at the children which are legally free for adoption, it is quite less. When you talk about India, we have the Central Adoption Resource Authority, which basically monitors this entire adoption process. But what we are witnessing is, in this backdrop, since we have less number of children being legally free for adoption, the Supreme Court has also expressed displeasure over the time-consuming adoption process. So it is taking huge amount of time for parents to adopt the children. Now, why is it so that the people are opting for adoption? Is it because of infertility? The experts are pointing that no, it is not merely because of the infertility. It is because adoption has now become normal when it comes to Indian society. And you can see states like Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Karnataka, West Bengal, they account for 50% of the prospective parents, okay, according to the data point. But what we are seeing, the issue with the adoption process is, it is a very time-consuming process. The average delay, okay, when it comes to the adoption process, it has increased from 1 year in 2017 to 3 years in 2022, and currently it is 3.5 years. So the experts are pointing out that if Central Adoption Resource Authority do not take adequate measures, then it might force the parents to adopt a child illegally. Now, why is it so that we have more number of children in the child care institution, but only few are available for adoption? See, when it comes to the process, the children who are there in the child care institution, how they would be declared as legally free for adoption. This process is regulated by the Juvenile Justice Act of 2021. So, what needs to be done here? We need to see that the children who are there in this child care institution, do they have any parent who is coming to visit them or not? When no parent is coming to visit them, only then such a child could be declared legally free for adoption. But due to this cumbersome process, what is happening is we have 8.5 times more children in the child care institutions as compared to the children who are declared legally free for adoption. As I told you, we need to look into that. Does the child who is there in these child care institution, do they have any parent who is coming to visit them? Do they have parents who have just maintained their name in the register or on the piece of paper, but they are not coming to meet them? So this is to be looked into by the CARA. So this agency is pushing to evaluate the children with no visits from their parents and an unfit parent or guardian. But this needs a lot of amount of follow-ups. That is the reason it is taking a lot amount of time for the children who are there in the child care institution to be declared as legally free for adoption. So because of this complexity, what is happening? Not every child in these child care institution can be made free for adoption. For instance, in Himachal, only one child is legally free for adoption in 2025, whereas we have more than 800 children in the child care institutions, according to the data point. Now, what are further issues we are witnessing with respect to adoption? So, what is happening because of this time-consuming adoption process? Majority of the children have actually reached in the age group of 14 to 18 years. 34% of the children who are declared to be legally free for adoption, they are within this age group. And in the Indian society, parents would not be ready to adopt such a child, because it would be very difficult for a grown-up child to accommodate in the family environment, in a new environment altogether. And the parents, prospective parents, they are not incentivized to adopt a child who is having special needs, etc. Okay, so this is another challenge that we are witnessing when it comes to adoption thing. And the parents, because of this thing, in order to avoid this long waiting time, what they are doing nowadays, they are ready to adopt a child which is in a higher age bracket. Okay, so previously they opted for adopting a child which is in the age bracket of 0 to 2 years, but now they are ready to adopt a child which is of higher age group. But this is problematic, okay, because the older child who is in the age group of 14 to 18 years, it would be problematic for that particular child to adapt to a new family setting altogether. So the experts have pointed out that whatever delay that we are witnessing when it comes to this entire adoption process, that needs to be audited well, so that we can identify the loopholes and we can take the proactive steps in that regard. Lastly, let's make note of certain prelim pointers with regard to this particular authority. So Central Adoption Resource Authority, it has been given the statutory status with Juvenile Justice Care and Protection of Child Act of 2015. So it is an autonomous body which was created in 1990 and it functions under the Ministry of Women and Child Development. This is the nodal body which looks into the adoption related matters. And it is the body which also deals with the inter-country adoption, as India has ratified the Hague Convention on Inter-Country Adoption. This deals with the adoption of orphans, abandoned, surrendered children, etc. In India, a child can be placed with a family under the Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act of 1956. We have the Guardians and Wards Act of 1890, and we also have the Juvenile Justice Act of 2000, which basically regulate the entire adoption process. Okay, wherein under this act, this particular agency determine that whether a child which is there in the child care institution is legally free for adoption or not. And all the child care institution, they need to register themselves with this particular agency. That's all that we need to know with regard to this particular topic. Let's move on to the next one. Now, recently, the government has started taking various steps to basically address the dumping activities which it has noticed with respect to certain countries. This particular topic we can associate with the economy section of the prelim syllabus. So what we are witnessing recently, Ministry of Commerce is using its various departments like the Directorate General of Foreign Trade and Directorate General of Trade Remedies to basically clamp down on the import surges and dumping that we are witnessing in the Indian economy. and it is also coordinating with other ministries as well. So what do we mean by dumping? Dumping actually means that let's suppose a X commodity is produced at a price of 100 rupees in China. Okay, so this is the selling price in China's economy when it comes to this X commodity. But when China would be dumping this X commodity in Indian economy, it might be selling it at rupees 80. So this is what is dumping. It refers to practice of exporting a good to other country at a price well below their normal rate. Okay, so these departments of Ministry of Commerce, they have last month curbed the import of certain alloys, okay, because they contain more than 1% of the gold. And if the importers would have imported gold, then they would have faced higher import duties. But since they are importing these alloys and these alloys consist 1% of the gold, they have to pay less amount of import duties. Okay, so in order to address these dumping activities from different countries and whatever trade related issues we are witnessing, so for that the two departments of Ministry of Commerce, that is Directorate General of Foreign Trade and Directorate General of Trade Remedies, are taking due action. For example, Directorate General of Trade Remedies has already begun the anti-dumping probe on import of several industrial chemicals including China, which are being exported from China to India. Now let's make note of certain pointers with regard to these two departments of Ministry of Commerce. So first is Directorate General of Foreign Trade. So it is basically an attached office under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. It is responsible for formulation and implementation of India's foreign trade policy. Its headquarters are situated in New Delhi and it operates with a network of 24 regional offices. Before 1991, it was known as Chief Controller of Imports and Export, but after LPG reforms, it was named as Directorate General of Foreign Trade to basically showcase that this body would now be acting as a trade facilitator. Okay, what are the key functions? So it issues the Importer-Exporter Code, which is a 10-digit unique code, which is mandatory for all the Indian exporters and importers if they want to, do foreign trade. It regulates the transit of goods across Indian borders as per bilateral treaties. If you people remember, this was the body which issued notification with regard to banning of import of jute products from the Bangladesh when it comes to land ports that we have with respect to Bangladesh. And it sets the standard input-output norms to define the quantity of inputs allowed for export of a specified quantity of output. Let's note down certain prelim pointers with regard to Directorate General of Trade Remedies also. So this body was established way back in 2018 and again it is working under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. The purpose is to basically act as India's anti-dumping watchdog. So it would be looking and it would be carrying out the probe with respect to all the unfair trade practices like dumping, subsidization, import services, etc. What are the functions of this particular body? To conduct anti-dumping investigations, as I told you, and make the necessary recommendation to government. Handles the anti-subsidy countervailing duty. Countervailing duty is imposed when exporting countries, let's suppose USA is exporting something, maybe an agriculture good here in India's economy, okay? USA, when it is giving a lot amount of subsidies for this particular agriculture good, then in that respect, in order to put in place fair trade practices, India can impose countervailing duty. So it is basically to offset the subsidies which are being given by the exporting country. Then it examines the safeguard measures to protect Indian industries, engage with WTO when it comes to trade related matters, and conduct outreach program to spread awareness of trade remedies. That's all that we need to know with regard to this topic. Let's move on to the next topic. Now, recently, the preliminary report which was released by AAIB authority, instead of giving details, it has created a lot of confusion. This particular topic you can associate with GS paper 2. So, today's article is basically talking about that the 15-page preliminary report which has been issued by the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, it is, instead of giving clarity on the incident as it is probing the plane crash with respect to Air India, it is actually creating a lot of confusion because it has given only certain amount of information in the preliminary report, and that is being interpreted by different experts in a different manner. Okay, and when a same thing, same event is interpreted by different people in a different manner depending upon who is reviewing it, such thing is referred to be as Rashomon effect. Okay, so we need to make note of this Rashomon effect. Now let's note down certain pointers with regard to this particular body, because this is what is more important for us. Okay, not the entire detail which is given in the article. So section 7 of the Aircraft Act of 1934 basically gives the central government the power to make rules for investigation of aviation related accidents, okay, which is arising out of or in course of the navigation in or over India of any aircraft or anywhere of aircraft registered in India. Earlier, Air Safety Directorate of the Directorate General of Civil Aviation was carrying out this investigation duty. But in accordance with the standards and recommended practices which are issued by the International Civil Aviation Organization, we separated the regulatory function of the DGCA from this investigative function. So this investigative function was given to this particular agency, Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau. Okay, so this Aircraft Investigation of Accidents and Incidents Rule of 2012 led to formation of this particular entity, and this is basically an attached office of Ministry of Civil Aviation. Now, when it comes to this particular entity, it has been given the power that it can get unrestricted access to all the relevant evidence with regard to an aviation accident, and for this it does not need to seek any prior approval from any government authority or from judicial body. Okay, so this is the power which has been given to this particular entity, and this entity is having the power to investigate all accident and serious incidents involving the aircraft over 2,250 kgs, all up weight. When I say this much weight, I am taking into account the weight of the aircraft with the passengers and the cargo. Okay, investigation would be focusing on how we can prevent future aviation accidents and not on assigning blame or liability. This has been specifically mentioned under Rule 3 of Aircraft Investigation of Accidents and Incidents Rule of 2017. Okay, so you can be asked this particular point in the prelims. What all additional functions are performed by this particular entity? So it carries out the safety studies and make the necessary recommendation to Directorate General of Civil Aviation. That's all that we need to know in today's analysis. Quiz would be coming right up next. So don't forget to practice the quiz and check the knowledge that how far you have been able to gain from this particular session. Till then, keep smiling, keep learning. Have a very nice day all of you.